All right. Hi, and welcome to Red Reviews, the podcast that is today covering some leftist theory or history.
Oh, yeah. Leftist theory and history. Absolutely. And it's, thank you for having me again. It's great to be back. I think this is number 30, right?
It is so.
This is number 30,
Big number 30.
Which is really exciting. That's awesome. I can't wait till we get to number 50. I don't know if that'll be this year or not. It might be. I don't know. Maybe not. I don't know. But anyway, tonight's book is, I think, fantastic. I loved reading every page of it. I think that there's so much information to learn from it, so much history, so much theory, so much sort of strategy. And the book is called Libertarian Socialism, Politics in Black and
Red. You actually got like the actual copy of it.
Yeah.
I've been reading the EPUB bowl.
I actually bought the physical. Well, PM Press at the end of last year had a 50% off sale on everything.
Ah, nice.
So I bought that. I bought this, and I bought CLR James book, and I bought something else. Nice. But anyway, yeah. So I just like physical books. But published by PM Press. It was edited by Alex Pritchard, Ruth Kenna, Saku Pinta, and David Barry. This is my kind of book. So my favorite thing to read is the essay. Essays are my favorite form of writing to read. And it's the thing that I write, and I love essays. And this book is a collection of essays by a variety of historians, scholars, activists, and philosophers who are going into this, essentially, as it says, Politics in Black and Red, the intersections of Marxism and anarchism, and whether there are convergences that are worthwhile to think about, and whether there are divergences to think about that are important, and where there are levels of agreement, where there are levels of disagreement, and how to sort of build a sort of libertarian socialist vision. And to a greater or lesser extent, I would identify as a libertarian socialist. And because, in the sort of the political compass test, right? Right. I'm more in that bottom left quadrant, with people like, Chomsky or whatever, or Bernie Sanders or other people. Although I think I'm more radical than
probably
Bernie.
Farther down and farther left.
Farther down and further left than Bernie. Yeah. But most of our political leaders in America fit in the top right, which is right authority. But anyway, I think that there's been this sort of, I think, intellectual monopoly on discussions of Marxism and anarchism, which have been heavily, I think, stifled and, just sort of atrophied by Leninism. And in this book, there's a lot of stuff that's interesting interpretations of Lenin that are sort of radical interpretations, whether it's Antonio Gramsci, the Italian Marxist, or somebody like Anton Panacek, the council communist. And we'll get into council communism because as I was reading it, I was like, I love this. I think this is great because it kind of blends like my Marxism and the anarchism in a way that I find really like interesting and gratifying.
It's satisfying. Yeah.
It's real satisfying. And so, obviously with my own, predilection as a Marxist, I gravitated more towards the more of the Marxist writers, but I was really intrigued by, some of the authors who very much are rooted in Marxism, but have a more radical or anarchist interpretation. So people like I said, Anton Panacek, the council communist, or Gramsci, or Daniel Guérin, the French anarcho-Marxist. And we're going to do one of his books later in the year because he's super interesting. Georges Sorel, the other Marxist. So I don't kind of know where to begin. Like there's so much in the book.
I got about, I think 43% of the way through it.
Okay.
So I'm up to council communists.
Okay.
Maybe a little bit into that a little bit. I thought the very first chapter of it, I thought, for myself was kind of frustrating, right? Like it seemed like a discussion of like anarchism from a almost a Leninist perspective, like
Mhm.
the dismissive
Yep.
tones and the kind of like the incorrect view of anarchism, in my opinion.
No, and I think that's fair. So the first one, if we skip the introduction, the first essay is by Paul Blackledge, who is like, of all of the writers in this book, he is like the more classical, like orthodox Marxist, like
Right.
without a doubt, right? And so a lot of the critiques that he has essentially is, that it kind of falls into the same kind of stuff where anarchism is insufficiently, empirical, or it's insufficiently it's insufficiently scientific,
right. Too utopian,
too idealistic, and so on. And I think that it is definitely like I don't know if Blackledge himself identifies as a Leninist. I think, if I remember correctly, let me see real quick. There's a Paul Blackledge. He's a member of the Socialist Workers' Party. I think SWP is Trotskyist, so I think he's a Trotskyist, but I could be wrong.
Okay.
But yeah, so I think if we get into kind of discussing part of that chapter is essentially like about human nature and his criticisms of people like Max Stirner. Max Stirner was this sort of, proto-socialist figure that Marx and Engels wrote about in the German ideology. Stirner wrote a book called The Ego and Its Own, which is this sort of radical individualistic manifesto that was influential on people like Nietzsche. Essentially, I'm quoting the chapter now where it's like, Stirner concluded that all moral approaches, because they preach self-sacrifice in the name of some metaphysical notion, God, man, the state, class, nation, and so on, were the enemies of freedom. Which, when I read this part of it with Stirner in my little like margins, because I write little notes in my margins when I'm reading too, is when I was reading that, I was like, well, that's just like Ayn Rand.
Right.
It reads like Stirner reads very much like Ayn Rand, and I think like I kind of like I would not. Like the kind of sort of radical individualism that Stirner advocated for is not something I am particularly interested in.
I haven't read Stirner, but I've had people tell me that that's not entirely accurate, and that he was more of the vein of like he didn't think that anything should be sacred, sort of thing. Like which is, I mean, he believed in collectivism in a sense, and he was a socialist in a sense, but not in the way that, you hold it as this sacred truth that can't be questioned.
Yeah, right. It reminds me very much of like, I find that Stirner and like Oscar Wilde would have been kind of kin in the sense that, if you read Wilde's like The Soul of Man Under Socialism, it has a lot of that sort of radical individualist, but also mixed with, deeply sort of, collective senses of like creating an ideal society. But again, it is kind of divorced from like material realities. It's very much it's very much a sort of broader metaphysical or ethical critique rather than being a like related to real realities. But I think it's unfair to say that anarchism doesn't have a conception of human nature, considering I think one of the most intelligent works on the left that has ever been written on human nature was written by an anarchist, and we've done it on the show, which is Mutual Aid, right? Yeah. Like, and if you go back to like people like the chapter talks about like Bakunin and Kropotkin have these sort of, overarching themes of, humans have this capacity for selfishness, but they also have this capacity for cooperation.
Right.
And, I thought the chapter was interesting in the sense that I've read a lot about like the sort of Marx and human nature debate. So like one of the books that I've read about it is a book by, oh my God, I'm blanking on his name. But he's a British Marxist who was basically, he wrote a critique, Norman Garris. His name was Norman Garris.
Okay.
And he wrote a critique of Althusser, the French Marxist, which I highly encourage people to read about his personal life on Wikipedia. It reads like a true crime novel,
Interesting.
or a true crime book. But anyway, Norman Garris essentially makes the argument in his book on Marx and human nature, which is very similar to Sartre, which is that there is no such thing as sort of a universal human nature, but there is such a thing as sort of human universal predilections or conditions. Like we all have to eat, we all have to drink, we all have to sleep, we all have to, we all have to go to the bathroom, we all have to have sex, like all these sort of universal things. We have to use our hands, our muscles, and our brains to transform nature in order to survive. Like we all, like those are universals that exist within humanity, but it doesn't necessarily mean that we have this like succinct human nature. But we do have one in the sense that, because Marx and early Marx writes about, the human essence. And that's the phrase that Marx uses, is the human essence. And because Althusser's argument, and there's sort of two tracks with Marxism, is it's that people who are like the early Marx and the late Marx are concurrent with one another. Marx is not rejecting his earlier beliefs.
Right.
And those are people like Norman Garris and Erich Fromm and others. And then there's the other track who are like, no, Marx kind of rejected
Marx
rejects the utopianism of his youth. And that's like Althusser and others, right? So like those are the two tracks. I'm very much of the first track, where I think Marx's thought is consistent throughout his lifetime. It just builds and expands.
Yeah.
He starts from a philosophic foundation and ends with an economic one. And I think that's part of why people think that they don't gel, but I think they do. I don't think there's anything in early Marx which necessarily contradicts late Marx. If anything, late Marx just sort of it fleshes out in a empirical way with his analysis of capitalism, what he was trying to articulate in a moral and normative sense in the earlier period.
Right.
But anyway, the Blackledge book chapter, I was kind of actually surprised that it was included in the collection, because I was like, this book this is the one chapter which is like, I think is the one that's the most traditional of like, anarchism is a joke. We shouldn't waste our time with it. I
think he gave it a good starting place though, right? Then you can build off of this clear critique into the kind of meshing of Marxism and other left things and anarchism.
For sure. I think one of the main themes of the book that I found interesting reading about certain figures, whether it was William Morris, the British socialist who wrote the classic, sci-fi novel News from Nowhere, which maybe we'll do on the show at some point, or we'll do his How I Became a Socialist essay. But I think William Morris is worth kind of going into. Somebody like him, somebody like C.L.R. James, who I love, and who Trotsky called a bohemian freelancer, which is
right. Yeah,
hilarious.
That's the chapter I'm actually on right now.
And then in the later chapters, you get into people like Cornelius Castoriadis and the Italian sort of post-Marxist left and others. You see within a lot of these thinkers who are sort of at the margins of both anarchism and Marxism, a real, I think ideological, lack of purity. There's this real interesting evolution over time. Like, for example, with C.L.R. James, he sort of starts as a sort of what we would call a rad lib, right? He's very much in the sort of moral liberal tradition, becomes a Trotskyist, and then leaves Trotskyism to develop his own form of, I think, heterodox Marxism, which integrates anarchist ideas, particularly about, spontaneity and about the continuing relevance of anti-bureaucratic critiques. Right. So like James's critique goes beyond Stalinism to actually actively critiquing Leninism itself. Mm-hmm. And I think that's interesting because James was somebody who lived, from I think like 1901 to 1989. He lived a very long time. He lived almost the entire history of the Soviet project. So he could kind of look at it from like the big picture. Right.
Right.
And as an historian, he's looking at it in a broader way too. But, I think that people, I think what makes him interesting is that like he never rejects his Marxism. There are some people who have like those anarchist influences, whether it's him or Panacek or Garin, they never reject their Marxism.
Right.
They just they give themselves space within their ideological worldview to include anarchist ideas,
which I can appreciate, like, because coming from what I always considered like a pragmatic anarchist type of viewpoint is like, I need, like, yeah, I consider myself an anti-statist, an anti-hierarchy person, but I need to be able to accept the evidence of new other things and new ideas and better, I need to keep growing too, right?
Right. And I'm kind of on the different end of it, where I'm a Marxist, and to a certain extent, at my most milquetoast, I'm kind of a social democrat. So, I believe in sort of the power of using the state for good, which could be wrong. Like, I admit that could be a position that is nonsense, right? But but I'm with you in that, like, the end goal is to live in a society where hierarchies are either eliminated or they are drastically reduced. I believe in a world where we can build the kind of democratic power, whether that comes in the form of councils, workers' councils, or that comes in the form of some form of, state, but also that is mixed with a heavy amount of trade unionism. Mm-hmm. I think as I've gotten more into my own political journey, a lot of my core principles have not really necessarily changed in terms of how I want society to sort of function and help people flourish and live, fulfilling and good lives. But I'm also like, I'm kind of pragmatic in that sense too, right? So we can look at like the short term of like, what is the possible within the next year or 2 years or 5 years? Okay. Now let's think out longer.
Let's expand this.
What might happen in 100 years?
Yeah.
What might happen in 1,000 years? Because I think that's the lack of, the lack of the capacity for the future is, I think, what has limited our political possibilities in modern times. It's capitalist realism. And I think that if we can get beyond some of those just hardened ideas of like, well, you can't do that. Why not? Right. And I also genuinely believe that we have to interrogate and genuinely like investigate the idea that the Soviet Union was a failure. Like, and I
think my thoughts on this are pretty well
like in the sense that, any of its more radical energies, it pretty much abandoned within the first few years. And then the kind of social democratic state capitalist system that it ultimately built was one that may have given people a certain amount of like material consistency, which I think it did, but that came at a huge cost in the sense that, you saw the elimination of opposition political parties. You saw the real bureaucratization of trade unions. Yeah. You saw the stifling of dissent and political heterodoxy. And I think all of those were a problem. And those are the exact same problems that the United States has today. It's the same problems, right? Like the sense of, where we are, like we're in a state where trade unions have become increasingly, more pro-management and have not, become increasingly more bureaucratic, despite, I think, the fact that they do a lot of good for workers. And I agree with that. Mm-hmm. Or, the fact that whatever social democratic gains that have happened in the United States have been largely reversed over a period of decades, which is what happened when the Soviet Union collapsed. I mean, its social democracy pretty much went away overnight. Right. It led to a huge amount of human suffering. Right. But so I think like, this is where I agreed with the last chapter. The last main chapter is about Antonio Negri and Michael Hart, the two writers who've written about Empire, Multitudes. Their writing is really, really idiosyncratic. Like it doesn't fit into a neat little box. Like it's not anarchist, but it's not Marxist, but it's not Leninist, but it's not anti-Leninist either. It's like, it's really interesting. But one point that I think they kind of get at is, thinking about getting beyond where we're at, like getting beyond Leninism. And I think that's without necessarily abandoning lessons from Lenin, which I agree with. Like, I think, we can learn so much from, building organizations. How does a party function? What, how do you build structures? that can actually sustain power. Like all of those are good lessons. The
Right.
nature of imperialism. Those are all things we can learn from Lenin.
Yep.
But Leninism in and of itself for most of the 20th century has been a political dead end. And so and I think people have to come to grips with that. Because if you look at the world today, there are only, what is it? 1, 2, 3, because the DPRK is like a weird outlier. It's not really Leninist either. But so
Right.
like if talking about like Marxist Leninist regimes, there's like 3. There's like China, there's 4. China, Vietnam, Laos, and Cuba, right?
And those are, they all vary quite a bit too in various ways, right?
Absolutely, right. So you have like Cuba is very much more of it's a lot more akin to the Soviet Union. It has a lot more of more of a top-down economy.
Yeah, nationalized everything.
Nationalized things. Whereas China is very much a state capitalist system.
Right.
Or state socialist, whatever you want to call it, right? But its economic activity is largely guided by the state. Mm-hmm. But there is also a huge amount of liberalization and market forces that exist within China, right?
Yeah. So
I think that we have to stop having this like weird sanguine view of these places. Like I think that these societies have achieved a lot of good things, but I think it's also important to openly like talk about things in which I think they've fallen far short of what they would like to do.
Yeah.
And you'll often hear from people on the left of like, oh, well, you're just some white guy in the West, bitching about how, like, look, like, I'm not telling them what to do. I'm just saying, like, from my own perspective, I feel like these societies are mixed bags. And I think that, like, there are, I think it's really hard for me to believe that, like, that's the best that we could do. Like, that's, I think that's for me is the frustrating part is it's like, it seems to me like if you just buy into the sort of orthodox Marxist-Leninist viewpoint, your political horizons are incredibly small. Like you can't get beyond it because there's a whole history of the political left, which includes anarchists, council communists, libertarian socialists who have argued for a different system.
Yeah.
And have argued for, and have done so in service of like if we think about C.L.R. James, right? Like C.L.R. James never ever really rejected Marxism.
Right.
Nor did he ever really reject a more radical version of Leninism. But what he did reject was obviously, I think he rejected Stalinism, and he sort of began to embrace the sort of the politics of non-hierarchy, the critique against bureaucracy.
He didn't. I think maybe I mistook what I read, but I think he also didn't like the idea of being called an anarchist. Like he didn't want to be an anarchist, but he did not like hierarchy. He did not like bureaucracy.
He was one of those guys who would say certain things. People go, well, that sounds pretty much like anarchism. Well, that's not who I am. And and I think like I identify with that to a certain extent because like would I identify as an anarchist? No, but like there's a lot about anarchism that I do identify with.
Right.
And but if you were to ask me what I am, ultimately I'm a Marxist. That's how I would describe myself in the broadest sense of the term, or a socialist. Like I'm open to the possibilities of different types of different models and conceiving of them in different ways. Like I believe that an international socialist like society where, there are going to be societies that do things a little differently. Mm-hmm, like I think like one country might be more council communist. One country might be more explicitly sort of anarchist or, like a state without a state, in terms of political organization, like Rojava, or you have like the Zapatistas in Mexico and other things. You're going to have, I think, Trotskyism, you're going to have Leninism, like it's all. And then you're also going to have like on the more right, on the right, you're going to have like radical social democracy, worker cooperatives.
See, now that's the political spectrum I like. On the right, you have radical social democracy.
Right, where it's like the far right of our political possibilities is like Bernie Sanders or like Swedish, like Norwegian, like the Scandinavian social democracy, right? Which has
That's
its
where our
flaws.
Overton window needs
That's
to be.
what I want the Overton window to be, right? Where it's like fascism
Yeah.
doesn't play a role.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I think that I was particularly taken with the Council Communist ideas, because a lot of that was, Anton Panacek, who also wrote a book on Lenin. I think it's called Lenin as a Philosopher, Lenin the Philosopher. He also wrote a very interesting book called Marxism and Darwinism, where he sort of compares Marx and Darwin, which I think is very, very interesting to me. Because I would argue the two most important thinkers of the 19th century are Marx and Darwin.
Right. Yeah.
And he also wrote about council communism. So what is council communism? It's instead of the priority of political organization being the political party, which is the Leninist formation, or necessarily the trade union.
Right.
It's rooted in workers' councils, which is what Soviets were. Like when Soviets were originally conceived, in 1905, 1906, with the earliest Russian Revolution before the overthrow of the Tsar 12 years later, they created these workers' councils where workers would come together and collectively make decisions. Mm-hmm. But they're more radical than worker cooperatives, because people out there be like, well, that sounds like worker cooperatives. I learned about that from Richard Wolff. So did I. But worker cooperatives are like honestly, they're just a less radical version of what councils are. Right. In the sense that worker cooperatives, let's say we have a society where like every business is a worker cooperative and we have robust social democracy. Like that's the baseline, right? Yeah. The problem with that is that chances are that system is still market socialist. Yeah. So it's under market pressures, right? So there is that need to compete. Mm-hmm. The other problem is that those kinds of businesses have to weather the vicissitudes of economic upturns and downturns. Because I think and if anybody needs any indication that this is the case, look at Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia, before it broke up, was a market socialist society. It was sort of different than the Soviet conception of how to build a sort of state socialist system. So it had more liberalized markets. It had much more of a liberalized form of trade within the system than the Soviet system did. And for a long time, it produced a lot of good for the public in terms of consumer durables. But very much like the United States in the 1970s, you have the sort of global economic downturn, and the market socialist system was hammered just as hard as the United States capitalism was, or Western capitalism was. So what workers' councils do is they go beyond that. So it's like the goal of a workers' council is to ultimately abandon the commodity form, to abandon wages, to abandon the market in general, and that the economy is organized and planned for the workers by the workers without the sort of constraints of the market, which is what worker cooperatives have to work under.
Yeah. Yeah. It's pretty good stuff. I think, I don't know. I think I'm pretty amenable to that council communism concept. Like I like it quite a bit.
Me too. I mean, because it kind of like combines everything that I like about Marxism and everything that I like about anarchism. It's like, in the chapter about council communist perspectives in talking about the Spanish Civil War. So the centerpiece of council communist theory is the notion that workers' councils constitute the main unit of revolutionary working class struggle and the base on which post-capitalist arrangements can be constructed, right? So one of I think it's more radical than this sort of vanguardist Leninist conception, which is that you take over the state, and then the state becomes, which is organized by the party, becomes the central animating revolutionary force of society, right? Right. So there's a much more of a distance between the workers and the sort of the for lack of a better word, the rulers of the system, right? Like, so there's a hierarchy. Like workers' councils, may have some forms of hierarchy, but generally they don't have them in the way that sort of the bureaucratization of the Soviet Union would have. And I love that. I think that's really good. I also think that it's more attainable. I think that if you could imagine building a workplace where, I can imagine, and people are going to be like, oh, you're just a reformist or whatever. But like, you could imagine a thing where, like in an evolutionary form, where worker cooperatives become councils over time, where, where we could build systems and the socialization of production would grow to a point that we could then abandon the commodity form. We could abandon the need for wage labor and produce solely based on need, like that. And council communism, it gets us to that next step. Like when I was talking earlier about like think 100 years in the future, 1,000 years in the future, like workers' councils are something that you could think of as being, to a certain extent in the immediate horizon, since you could organize them, but in the long-term horizon, in that they can provide us with a form, if and when capitalism finally does, kick the bucket, we're ready.
Yeah.
And that's what I really liked about it.
Yeah. Like, that's one of the things, many anarchists kind of have in their theory of the future, kind of councils of various types that are elected and that easily recallable, and that's they do the meeting for making decisions based on votes and all that, like, so that the more power is in the hands of the people, and they're just temporary representatives versus like one party staying in power forever, or like democratic or like representative democracy as
Yeah, it's because I think that the limitations of the vanguard party are the same limitations that exist within capitalist forms of political organization. Right. So like because people always say like the United States is a one-party state. And that's true. I mean, as Gore Vidal, one of my favorite authors who we'll be doing a book on later in the year, he says very plainly, and, Vidal was no socialist. He's more in the radical liberal tradition, but Vidal basically says, like, in the United States, we have one party. It's the property party. And there are two right wings. Yeah. The Democrats and the Republicans. And he's right. Like, that is true, right? Yeah. There's that other great quote by the African leader Julius Nyerere, which is that, America is a one-party state, but in typical American extravagance, it has two of them. And that's true, right? Like, yeah. I think it's absolutely true, right? Whereas in a place like the People's Republic of China, it is a one-party state, right? Yeah. And it's the party, you could say it's the party of socialism, you could say it's the party of communism, because it calls itself the Communist Party. But again, it has the same limitations, which is that when you have this sort of party form which monopolizes politics, it narrows the windows of possibility, right? So, like, could I imagine council communism becoming a thing in China? No, not under the system it is now. Right. Maybe on a local level, like maybe in some smaller town in some smaller province, and it would probably more than likely be maybe agricultural workers. Right. But the party is in order to not get suppressed, it would have to consist of members of the party. Yep. Right? You'd have to be members of the party. You'd have to go along with whatever the central party is, because that's democratic centralism, right? Yep. And so, I think that what the sort of anarcho-Marxists like Panacek and George Sorel, and I absolutely loved reading the chapter on George Sorel, and I actually bought his book, Reflections on Violence. We will definitely be doing that book because I like reading about this other tradition, this sort of non-Leninist Marxist tradition. I'm like, oh, I think I'm actually closer to this these days. Like, right. In terms of like, oh, this is super interesting. And with Sorel particularly, one thing that he talks about, which I geeked out to right away, because it reminded me of what we talked about when we did our first episode of the year on The Dawn of Everything. Remember we were talking about the idea of how the state is formed in our episode on that book, and we talked about charismatic politics. Right. And how charismatic politics is kind of one of like the three, if it's a three-legged stool, it's like one of the three legs on that stool that makes a political state work. And Sorel writes about that, but he uses different language. He talks about myths. Mm-hmm. And the power of myths and how myths build societies. And I was like, I love this because I think this is absolutely true. So like think about Lenin as a concept, right? Like I have a poster of him behind me, right? Like he's like this big figure,
Right.
and I collect Soviet art. I love it, but he becomes this myth. Like there's the man and then there's the myth, right?
Yeah.
We were talking about him in the pregame. An American version of this is Lincoln.
Right.
Lincoln is this like American political myth that is a binding agent for political consciousness in a society, right? And I think that we underplay, sometimes I think in Marxism, as Marxists, we underplay the role that like binding beliefs or myths or, charismatic figures, like whatever you want to call it, have over a political system.
Right.
And what I think council communism does, or anarcho-Marxism or anarchism does, is it really interrogates the problematic nature of what that is and how dangerous that can be.
Yeah.
So it can be kind of good in some sense, right? So like we believe in the story of like the Paris Commune, or we believe in the story of the Spanish anarchists fighting against fascism. We believe in the story of Rojava, right? Like or for Marxist-Leninists, it's like the story of China, or the story of Cuba, right?
Right.
These stories that we tell ourselves are they're not lies, but they're not necessarily truths in like the empirical scientific sense.
And actually, like the chapter on the CNT and the Spanish anarchists, like that chapter kind of pointed out some of the problems that with the CNT and how they kind of compromised their values in some ways in order to get along with the political system and the parties that were doing, or the People's Front, I think it was.
Right. Like in the conclusion of that chapter, that's Saku Pina's chapter. Well, it's like the American councilists, while sympathetic to the cause of the Spanish anarcho-syndicalists, directed two major criticisms at their performance in the revolutionary situation in Spain. First, the anarchist workers failed to create unified economic political organs of workers' power in areas in which they clearly had a dominant position and suppressed counter-revolutionary elements. In neglecting to do so, they allowed a weakened state power to reemerge, culminating in and second was a theoretical weakness, which recognized the dangers of statist bureaucracy, but did not extend this understanding to the syndicates, where the CNTFAI leadership became gradually separated from the self-organized activity of the working class. Yeah. And I do think that is going to be a challenge with councilism, right? Any kind of form of political organization is bound together by shared beliefs and sort of shared myths. And I'm not saying myth as if it's bullshit. Like I'm saying like they're narratives, right?
Yeah.
And I'm not trying to like go Jordan Peterson either, but like I'm talking about like political narratives that we believe and that animate us based on our propensity to see them as true or not.
Despite Jordan Peterson's level of bullshit, narratives and their psychological effect are a thing.
Absolutely. And there's, interestingly enough, in a few weeks, we'll be doing a book by Lizette Kalikowski on Marxism and humanism. And Kalikowski wrote a book about this called The Presence of Myth, where he kind of lays it out. Like the thing about Jordan Peterson, I'm sorry, I'm going to do a bit of a tangent. The thing about Jordan Peterson is that there are people who did what he did and they did it better. Like that's the thing that's like fascinating to me, is that like he's a shittier version of like Joseph Campbell, or he's a shittier version of Lizette Kalikowski, or he's like a shittier version of Young. It's like, why go to that guy? Like go to the source. The only thing that would be worthwhile from a Jordan Peterson book is the references.
Yeah, that's right.
Then you could go into what's he reading, and go, okay, well, this is probably worthwhile to check out.
Which Maps of Meaning might have some interesting references.
Dear God.
I don't think 12 Rules for Life or whatever the fuck that is would have much for decent references.
No, I don't think so either. But no, so like, I do think that like one of the things about charismatic politics, or the presence of political myths that's a problem, is the sort of charismatic leader, right? As somebody who's been involved in multiple, political organizations over the years, somewhere in the atheist movement, somewhere in the socialist movement. One thing I can tell you is that there are leaders within those groups that are kind of charismatic people, that people kind of go with what they want.
Yeah.
They rarely will ever challenge them,
Right.
And I think that those are the challenges of a workers' council, is that, you know, a workers' council to be effective would have to be an organization made up of almost solely of leaders.
Right.
But then that has a problem too,
Yeah,
because then it's like you have too many cooks in the kitchen. And then it's everybody's sort of vying for their piece of, you know, because you're not going for money, right? So you're going for something else. You're going for legacy, or you're going for glory, you know, or I love Star Trek. You think of the Klingons, you think about honor, right? Like,
like there's still like reputational power, right? Like that's still a thing that there are, unfortunately, various hierarchies that form if you aren't vigilant about it all the time.
Right, exactly. And I think that's really, I think the key point about why I think anarchist theory is so essential and why I think it's so important is it acts as a check upon the worst excesses of other forms of the left,
right?
Whether it's a sort of regressive social democracy where it's predicated on, you know, you've got universal health care, but we also hate immigrants.
Right.
Right. Like, you know, or the sort of the flip of that, which is the sort of state capitalist or state socialist, Marxist Leninist states that have an incredible amount of hierarchy and top down. Yeah. You know, it's like China has billionaires, you know. Yeah. It's not like they don't. They have less of them, and they don't have as much as people in America, but there are billionaires.
Yeah.
And I mean, I will give credit where credit is due. I mean, to a certain extent, I mean, China does actually prosecute its ruling class from time to time, which is something the United States does not do.
Just refuses to do.
Which the United States just doesn't do, right? Yeah. Like, that's part of the reason why, like, part of my move out of liberalism and my move towards the left was quite frankly, a lot of it was the fact that I think the mainstream media for so long, because, like, especially, you know, 5, 6, 7 years ago, you know, I was less billionaires per capita. That's true. Yeah, that's absolutely true. Yeah. Without a doubt. And I think in terms of financial regulation and in terms of regulating businesses, I think China does it better than we do. But it's easier to be better than us. It's like easier to be better than the United States, because the United States just doesn't do anything, right? Like, right. As we've seen, you know, I like for these to be evergreen, but here's I think a thing about current events that is relevant is the collapse of Silicon Valley Bank, which we've seen over the last few days, right? Why did Silicon Valley Bank collapse? It collapsed because the Dodd-Frank financial regulations bill, which was passed in 2010, was essentially gutted 5 years ago during the Trump administration. It's a matter of policy, which Democrats and Republicans both supported. Right. You know, Mark Warner, who is a Democrat, was one of the most stalwart defenders of the deregulation of banks in 2018 and went along with Republicans. And even after Silicon Valley Bank collapsed, he still supported what he believed in. I mean, I'll give him A for effort in terms of the consistency, but, you know, and it also doesn't help when one of the key architects of Dodd-Frank, because it's named after two guys, right? Chris Dodd and Barney Frank. Barney Frank ended up working as a lobbyist for a bank. And lobbied on behalf of gutting the very reform that his name's on. So, like, this is the problem of, you know, capitalist state relations.
Yeah, yeah.
And so, you know, maybe China does that a little better than we do, but it's a lot easier for them to, because they don't have the same capitalist relations that we do, in the sense that it is heavily state regulated. There is a one-party state. There is no real political opposition. There's no, you know, there's no real democracy in the small d sense, in the sense that people debating various ideas. I mean, yeah, you can debate various ideas, but if you're doing it within the structure of one party and you don't have other parties and you don't have other oppositions,
unless you can win over the rest of the party or the leadership.
Unless you win over the rest of the party, which, again, that's going to be solely reliant upon whether or not you can get Xi on board, because you know, the People's Congress over there in China, like, just voted to give him more power. So, like, it's, you know, so I think it's important to be nuanced. Like, I don't want to be like the shit on China, all the guy died.
Right.
But, like, I do think it's important to note that, like, very much in the CLR James tradition, right? Where it's like, you know, the enemy of my enemy is not my friend.
Yeah.
Like it's in the sense that the United States is this empire which has wreaked untold suffering upon the world, and I think which our public leaders should be held accountable for. And at the same time, the limitations of state socialism are inherent in the way that systems like China are built, because it has all those contradictions inherent in them. The one thing I'll give them credit for is that I think to a certain extent, the political leadership know those contradictions exist. Whether or not they do something about them is a whole other story, but I think they do know that they exist.
Yeah, whereas American politicians are pretty clueless about what the
Yeah, most of them are fucking idiots. I will give it, pound for pound, I think that, the Chinese People's Congress is probably smarter than the US Congress is.
I would wager on it. I don't know how we would measure it, but
Lauren Boebert's existence alone,
yeah,
kind of ensures that, or Marjorie Taylor, Taylor Greene, Marjorie Trailer Park Green, I think that, or somebody like, Chip Roy of Texas, who's a complete moron, or Paul Gosar, like these people are idiots.
Matt Gaetz,
like these people are idiots.
Yeah.
And the thing is that in the American system, no one ever pays the price for being wrong.
No, that's right.
And that's the problem, and part of what I was going to say earlier was part of my sort of journey out of being a liberal and going to being a socialist, and acknowledging that, like, this system in many ways is beyond repair, is acknowledging that Trump is never going to see the inside of a jail cell.
No,
it's never going to happen.
Not gonna, yeah.
And the reason it's never going to happen is because if you open up a former president to any kind of scrutiny like that,
then
you have to open all of them up to it. And that's never going to happen. Right?
They can't let that happen.
And the past is prologue on this. We've talked about this before when we talked about when Obama became president, and him constantly saying is like, we're not looking backward, we're going forward, about Bush and the, mass surveillance of Americans without warrant.
Yep.
The warrantless wiretaps. The torture at Abu Ghraib, and the horrific conditions of Guantanamo, and the lying, the lies that got us into the war in Iraq, all these horrible things. No one was ever really held accountable for any of this. With the exception, the only person who ever really was held accountable for any kind of crime was Scooter Libby, who was Dick Cheney's chief of staff, who had outed Valerie Plame, who was the CIA agent.
Right.
But here's the thing. Trump fucking pardoned his ass a few years ago. So, like, doesn't mean shit.
Yeah.
So it's like, I think he also pardoned Jack Abramoff too,
and Roger Stone,
and like all of these like scum suckers of the earth. So yeah, I think that, I think that's really where the anarchist critique is so important.
Yeah. Is
you have to challenge power. You have to challenge. Why do these hierarchies exist? You need to justify them. That's the Chomsky point. You need to justify why power is organized and constituted the way it is.
Yeah.
And
almost never, like, if you have people that are like unelected making decisions for people that aren't, voted on decisions, then you almost never have like a real good justification for power over from one person over another. Like it's never as good as it sounds to the people who have power.
Right. And that's the role of myth, right? That we buy into these because these are the narratives that we accept.
Yeah.
And whether implicitly or explicitly, right?
Right.
So, unfortunately, we live in capitalism and its power seems immeasurable, as Ursula K. Le Guin once said.
Yeah.
And so like when I go into somewhere and I use a credit card and I buy something, unfortunately, that's me implicitly kind of buying the myth, whether I like it or not. Right. And, you can be the most radical badass, but at the end of the day, if you use US or Canadian currency to buy, a sandwich, like, unfortunately, you are constrained by the very system in which you are trying to actively critique.
I just heard this is kind of a tangent. I just heard a bit of a news thing this morning about a guy who his rent went up about $700 over the course of 2020 to 2022. So he went into the woods and built a cabin on land that nobody really had nobody went to, But then conservation officers found him. And so the RCMP went out and tore down his shack. And he was going to, he was being charged with various things, trespassing, what have you. But I guess the charges were dropped or whatever. And that's the guy who is no longer implicitly buying the myth, right?
Right.
Which is where I was going with that.
Exactly. That it's you'd almost have to be like a crazy paranoid to really reject it, right? Because these are the sort of ties that bind us, unfortunately, right?
Yeah,
and
you reject certain things and you just go out and you live on your own, away from everybody else, off the grid or whatever.
Yeah. And even then, right, you're still, regardless of how separated you are from the system, you are still a product of it and you are still interacting with it in some capacity.
Yeah, that's right.
You know, like if you're getting electricity from somewhere, then then you're a part of it. If you're driving a car, you're a part of it, right? If you have your Jeep,
if you use gasoline for a generator,
exactly. Like you are, and I think that's, because people, because this is a common stupid right-wing argument we hear against socialists. Well, you're criticizing socialism from your iPhone, which is like the iPhone thing is so dumb, and how anybody can even continue to use it is beyond me.
Both the internet and the iPhone are a product of
they're a product of government planning. They're, the vast majority of the technologies that are in the iPhone were created with DARPA money. I mean, it's not like, but yeah. So yeah, I mean, I think that the figures in the book that I really took something away from were the sort of anarcho-Marxists, people like CLR James and Anton Panacek and Daniel Guerin. And kind of leading into our discussion, there's a passage from the chapter from Daniel Guerin where he says, it's quoting here from David Barry's essay, Guerin insisted that Marx and Engels envisioned the dictatorship of the proletariat as being exercised by the working class as a whole rather than by an avant-garde, but that they didn't adequately differentiate their interpretation from that of the Blanquists, who were these French radicals who sort of essentially were proto-vanguardists. Mm-hmm. This made possible Lenin's later authoritarian conceptions. Lenin, who saw himself as both a Jacobin and a Marxist, invented the idea of the dictatorship of a party substituting itself for the working class and acting by proxy in its name. This, for Guerin, was where it all started to go badly wrong. Yeah. I agree. I think that one of the problems in interrogating theory is there's a big divide between what theory was written and then what actually happened, right? So with Lenin, that's absolutely the case in the sense of, the getting rid of the citizen constituencies and banning opposition political parties. Anarchists were no longer really allowed to organize after 1919. Yeah. And that was really only in deference to Kropotkin. You have the development of of what would eventually become the KGB. You have the secret police, right? And I think these are legitimately serious questions, right? So if you're trying to build a worker society and you're the only one and you're surrounded by capitalism with all of its money and all of its arms, and you're actively being invaded and you're actively being fought, what would you do? And I think that's the bigger question is it's like, did Lenin have a choice? Did the Bolsheviks have a choice? Yeah. And you could argue maybe they did, but maybe they didn't. And history is a messy thing. Yeah. And so where I think Guerin's critique is spot on is that we have to critique that at the roots of it. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. The idea of the vanguard in and of itself is something that like maybe doesn't really constitute a working class politics in the sense that, if you're only having this like elite cadre of people,
Yeah. In what way are they now the working class still?
And now what way are they the working class, right? Yeah. But then it's like, then you have to ask yourself, and it's like, this is the stuff that goes on in my brain where it's like, okay, well, I'm going to play the devil's advocate. Well, how is the working class going to do it then? Yeah. And because I'm not as bought into the idea of just sort of like the spontaneous nature of the working class. Like I don't necessarily see because history has shown us what happens in those situations, right? Like some of the biggest sort of protests in 1968 in France are a good example of this sort of emerging, spontaneous working class, almost general strike. And it ultimately didn't result in much of anything.
Yeah. Yeah, like you could even say like the 2020 uprisings in the U.S. By and large, I mean, one of the largest series of protests in a long, long, long time. And
in American history. I mean,
like-
it's one of the biggest social movements in American history. Yeah.
what changed?
Nothing. If anything, shit got worse.
Right.
You know, because 2 years later, Joe Biden's given a State of the Union address where he says, fund them in reference to the police, right?
Yeah.
So the hollowness of it, I think, is the problem. And I think the chapter that's on the Black Skin, White Masks chapter about African American struggles in the United States in the radical socialist tradition, that there were those two tracks, right?
Mm.
So the earlier democratic socialist tradition of people like Bayard Rustin and A. Philip Randolph and others, and Martin Luther King, was dedicated to nonviolence, that nonviolence was built into the core of it. And that was from a sort of more radical anarchist tradition of the most revolutionary act you can do is not to perpetuate violence. And is to fight for nonviolent struggle, right? But then there's the other track that would come later.
The Friends of Durruti would disagree.
The Friends of Durruti would disagree, as would the Black Panthers.
Right.
And SNCC, when SNCC was eventually led by Stokely Carmichael, Kwame Ture. So even within the American Civil Rights Movement itself, they would reject this, especially by King's death.
Right.
And so that sometimes the only thing a violent system will understand is violence. And so then it gets into those questions of violence, right? And the George Sorrell chapter is, you know, the idea of reflections on violence is in the sense that violence in and of itself can be value neutral, in the sense that there are times where violence may be the only way.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, right? But we, you know,
I'll bring that up on the screen.
Oh yeah. I think they're great. I wouldn't say that nothing has changed. I think there's been some really interesting organizing and thinking that has come out of 2020 and after. I just think it's not systematic change. I agree with you.
I think that's fair.
I agree with you. And I would clarify my statement to agree with that. Yeah. I think in terms of like translating into like broader systemic policy change, no. But I do think there are interesting things, right? In terms of, you know, maybe reforms on bail reform or district attorneys, although we saw what happened to Chesa Boudin, who was the district attorney in San Francisco, that they essentially forced him out of office. Mm-hmm. And that's the liberals. So imagine what the conservatives will be like, right? Yeah. I mean, and so anyway, yeah, I mean, I know we're getting towards an hour here, but I think we've hit a lot of the main points. Oh, I wanted to talk about some of the later chapters in the book because these were the ones that I thought were interesting, but also they were the ones I found the most frustrating. So this is where we get into like the situationists like Guy Debord.
Okay, yeah.
Socialisme ou barbarie, socialism and barbarism, the sort of progenitor of the sort of precursor to the situationists. And it's this sort of some of it's to a certain extent like a rejection of Marxism. Mm-hmm. And it's also also at the same time, kind of a rejection of anarchism too. It's sort of this post-Marxist, post-anarchist thought. The chapter that I think I found frustrating, and maybe it's my own sensibilities, and maybe I'm not sufficiently radical, but the chapter on the carnival anarchists, talking about those in Australia and New Zealand, this is in the later part of the book. Okay. Of these people who, like, what they would do is their whole thing was like, we have to bring back like the politics of play and this and that and the other. And I'm like, I agree with you. Like, it's fun to like play games and have fun and whatever. But it was ultimately like their politics to me seemed very narcissistic in the sense that it was all about like, you know, express yourself and blah, blah, blah. And it's like, where's your class analysis? Where's your like real interrogation of anything? And some of them were just, it was like, oh, let me see if I can pull up some of it. Cause it was just really frustrating. Like, and also like these groups didn't really have any, they didn't really have any real power, like at all. Right. They didn't really do anything. Carnivalists, here we go. Carnivalists were drawn to situationist praxis, including rejecting work and everyday boredom and emphasizing the festival-like nature of riots and revolutions. This was because they generally saw the Situationist International, which is the Guy Debord organization in the 1960s and 50s, ideas as complementing and bolstering their attempts to fuse art with politics and to fuse the counterculture with the revolutionary project. So some of that I think is good in the sense that, you know, fusing culture and art with politics is incredibly important. Is, you know, like somebody who,
There's, I think the It Could Happen Here podcast recently did an episode on the Situationists, or they discussed the Situationists, and it's interesting, the mix, like you say, of art and the use of it to subvert political ideas, and like you can do stuff with that. It's interesting stuff, but you actually have to intentionally do stuff with it.
Right. Exactly. And, in the sort of Australasian period of the 60s and 70s, which one of the last chapters is about, they talk about there's sort of two different groups. So there's sort of the sort of council, sort of workers' council anarchists, and they're most identified with, I think, the the self-management group of Australia.
Comment here from some random geek. The Situationists are an interesting group, and I have read The Society of the Spectacle.
Yeah, I have too, and I learned about it in undergrad. I took a sort of seminar course where we read a book by Greil Marcus called Lipstick Traces, which is a great book on sort of counterculture in the 60s and 70s. And there's a great chapter in that book, or a great section in that book, on the Situationists and the Society of the Spectacle. And I think that, Debord's influence on thinking about that is like so interesting to me. And I think that when we're talking about the Situationists, I think there's a lot to learn there. I'm trying to pull up that chapter here because, the Society of the Spectacle book is kind of critical of both Marxism and anarchism. As the chapter by Jean-Christophe Ognat notes, he's like, in the Society of the Spectacle, Debord recognized that on the one hand, in 1936, anarchism did indeed initiate a social revolution, a revolution that was the most advanced expression of proletarian power ever realized. But he argued that, on the other hand, the uprising was not an anarchist initiative. It was a defensive reaction against a military coup, and they were unable to effectively defend the revolution against the bourgeois, the Stalinists, the fascism. Nevertheless, despite this seeming proximity to Marxism and Marxist tropes, which that kind of sounds vaguely Marxist, there's a very real open critique of Marxism and Situationism. A critique which not only attacks the progressive degeneration of Marxism, but also points out the germs of that degeneration in Marxist personality and work. Debord is one of those guys who is actively interrogating Marx and going back to the source.
Right. Like, he's a postmodernist, right? Like, he's an actual postmodernist.
Yes. And so, but there was something else. I'm trying to remember where I wrote this down. Maybe I didn't. But here we go. So the concept of alienation.
I feel like I have such a knee-jerk reaction to anything involving libertarianism. I will definitely go back and forth and watch from the beginning of this. Interested to hear more of your thoughts.
Oh, yeah, for sure. So I have the same issue. I mean, part of it is that kind of two things happened at once in the United States, at least, and sort of broadly in the West, was that libertarianism, pretty much up until the mid-20th century, was left politics. That was what it was. And if you described yourself as a libertarian, you believed in sort of the elimination of the state, but you also believed in sort of the elimination of hierarchy, and it's like the quote, it's like somebody, I'm trying to remember which thinker, but it's like, all anarchists are socialists, but not all socialists are anarchists. I probably have more issues with libertarians than libertarianism. Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. One of these days, it's been an essay I've been meaning to write forever, but maybe it might just be easier to do like a fun live stream where we talk about my years being involved in the libertarian movement in the United States. Damn you, Roy Rothbard, for stealing our word. Absolutely.
Yeah, that's right.
Absolutely. And that happened for a variety of reasons, because the word liberal was sort of warped and kind of bastardized by social democracy and social democrats. So in the United States, instead of social democrats calling themselves as such, because that word was too close to socialism, they called themselves liberals.
Right.
And so the liberal tradition in the United States is actually closer to like the social democratic tradition of Europe. Liberalism in the vast majority of the world means like what we think of when we think of like big L libertarianism, where it's like free markets, free trade, sell your kidney on the black market to get some Bitcoin to pay for your rent through an NFT, like that kind of really, disgusting hyperbolic notion of but yeah, it's I think libertarianism it's very idealistic. Like people criticize anarchism for being idealistic. Like Jesus Christ, like libertarians, like they have this weird thing where it's like humans are selfish and power hungry and greedy. So we shouldn't build systems at all. Classic liberals, even Maureen Rothbard hated that the word liberal meaning. Absolutely. Yeah. And, and Hayek and Mises felt the same way.
Yeah.
Mises, I think, wrote an entire book called Liberalism, right? Where he's defending, economic, free market, non-protectionist, non-state acting capitalism. It's unabashedly pro-capitalism. And so, yeah, liberalism in the United States is really warped. It doesn't really mean what it means.
Yeah.
But it does at the same time. Like it's very strange. But yeah, so in thinking about the Situationists again, one of the things that's I think crucial to understanding them is the concept of alienation, which they pull, of course, from Marx. Alienation becomes a key component because what the Society of the Spectacle is doing, and what so many writers would find an inspiration from Debord, and is sort of critiquing consumer society, right? So what these writers in the 50s and 60s are doing is they are writing in response to two trends that are happening at the same time. One is the bureaucratization and the sort of reactionary, the counter-revolutionary nature of Soviet Russia and Soviet Union in their eyes. And then the other component of it is critiquing American, or broader, the Western consumerist society. Mm-hmm. And there's a part of the chapter where it goes into this, where it's like spectacle is alienation insofar as the passive contemplation of images, which have moreover been chosen by someone else, substitutes for what is experienced and for the determination of the events by the individual itself, and eventually dominates the individual, right? That is consumerist society, right? So like when we talk about how people in America wouldn't revolt. They're too busy watching football on Sundays.
Right.
Like, that is the spectacle.
The revolution will not be televised.
The revolution will not be televised, right? In the sense that, the spectacles, or as Alain Badiou would call them, events, like the event, or the spectacle, whatever you want to call it, are these consumer-driven capitalist inventions which rob us of our ability to directly experience life head on, and that it is then filtered through a commercial product, right? Like, and we're all products of this, right? So like, yeah, I just shit on like football or whatever, but like, that's also Marvel movies.
Yep. Oh yeah.
Like Marvel movies are spectacles, right? Yeah. Or, like the tabloids, right? Like, following the Real Housewives, like that's a spectacle. Like these are all things which alienate individuals from their own experience of life.
Yeah.
American football, what I call hand egg. Oh, that's funny. That's is our modern day bread and circus. American football is today gladiators. Absolutely. And not only that, but also it's extremely dangerous. I think that football, I think as somebody who tends to be more on the side of freedom, but like, I don't know. I think it's really hard to make an argument for football to continue, American football, because the vast majority of the people who play it end up with CTE and are horrifically disabled, or they have horrible health conditions. Most of them don't live past 60. Like it's not healthy. It's really dangerous to be a football player. But yeah, so I think like Debord's analysis of that is so interesting. And the sort of carnival anarchists of the Australasian period in the 70s kind of take this to its more kind of weird extreme. Like when I was reading about them, I was like, oh, this is the kind of shit that Christopher Lasch, who we've talked about before, this is the kind of shit he would call like the culture of narcissism, where it's you're abandoning class politics. You're banning any sense of connection to the working class, which a lot of these, carnival anarchists didn't have a fuck all to do with, like, real worker struggles going on in Australia and New Zealand. And it's all just sort of this politics of self-indulgence, which I find a bit jarring.
It sounds like bourgeois politics.
It does. It sounds super bourgeois, right? And it's that sort of post-left is just that post-left thinking.
Yeah.
And I was talking earlier, I think in the pregame, about Ernesto Laclau and Chantal Mouffe and left populism, which is in the last chapter when they discuss Hardt and Negri. And left populism is the theory that, like, that class is not going to be the central animating force that's going to, radicalize the working classes. It's going to be organizing around identities and marginalized identities at that. Now, there's nothing necessarily wrong with that, but the problem is that framework is much more susceptible to being co-opted. And I think it already has been. Mm-hmm. So, like, if you look at the Left Populist Project, and if you look at left populist governments that have come to power, like in the Podemos government in Spain is a good example of this. Time and time again, self-described socialists will institute austerity, right? Like, it's, if you're animated not upon, if class is not a central valence of your political analysis, it leaves you open to that politics of identity, which is then sort of co-opted by capitalism in service of its own needs. This is how you can get, like, the FBI, like, talking about its Pride Day. Right?
Yeah, that's right.
Which, again, I'm not necessarily against that. Like, that's great. Like, but at the same time, you're the fucking FBI. Like, it's like
you suck, whether you're diverse or not.
Like, you are the, you are the gangsters. Like, you are the gangster enforcers of the state. Like, I don't need you to tell me. And I think, like, when people, like, criticize, and I hate using this word and I apologize in advance, woke stuff. Like, when people, like, first off, most people don't know what the fuck they're talking about. Like, ask them, what do you mean by woke, dude?
Yeah.
But the problem is that if you completely separate your political, project from any notion of worker concerns or the nature of work or how work exists or being a working class, I think it just becomes this kind of superficial project that ultimately is about making the hierarchy more diverse, but not destroying the hierarchy altogether.
Right. It's hiring a black person who happens to be in charge of bombing your neighbor country or what have you.
Right. Right. It's how, like, it's like how a person like Kamala Harris, who is half African-American, half, half, I think,
it's tokenism. Indian. Yeah.
It is tokenism. Right. I mean, think about, why was Kamala Harris chosen? It wasn't for politics necessarily, and it wasn't for her, like, charisma, because I could not imagine this in my own lifetime, that there is a female politician that is less likable and less charismatic than Hillary Clinton is. But Kamala Harris is it. I mean, it's mind-boggling. She couldn't win a national election. If it was her against Trump, she'd be destroyed. Or her against, like, DeSantis, she would be absolutely obliterated. Because people see it. They see it for what it is, which is just this empty, vacuous notion of thinking about marginalized identities.
Yeah.
And it's like, because if you're not interested in actually changing people's lives, like their material conditions as marginalized people, then you don't really give a fuck. Like, like, you can say, like, trans women are women, and I agree with you, and that's a great first step. But you also have to talk about, like, okay, well, if trans women are women, which I agree with you, and I would wholeheartedly believe in that. That's right. Some random geek. Yeah.
The fascists, right-wingers, and reactionaries use woke as an insult because they all cannot use the N-word. Lover. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. Yeah. It's the woke has become the new term, or CRT has become the new busing, right? It's a way of talking about racist attitudes without actually saying it, right? For those who don't know, I won't like go into too much detail, but Lee Atwater, who was this, like, Republican stooge who ran George H.W. Bush's 1988 campaign. There's this infamous quote of his where he basically says, like, at some point you couldn't say the N-word. Mm-hmm. And so we had to find ways to talk about black people without actually talking about black people. So we talked about busing. We talked about We talked about affirmative action, or we talked about other things. It was a way of talking about race without actually talking about race. Yeah, woke is the new SJW. No, that's right.
Yeah,
right. Like
that's right.
no one says SJW anymore, right? Or if you do, like you must have been frozen in a pod from 2014, right? Like,
Yeah.
or woke or CRT or whatever they want to say, right? And or it was, what Dave Rubin called the regressive left, like
Oh, yeah,
whatever
yeah.
crap, whatever term they want to use, right? And it's part of why this stuff succeeds in popular culture and in political, the sort of broader political consciousness, is because there is not a political left that is strong enough and articulate enough to genuinely fight back against it in a way that will be meaningfully effective.
Mhm.
And I think that's the challenge that we have on the left is trying to find better arguments against it. And just, because, those myths, right? When we go back to Sorel again, myths can be bad too.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like we've talked about animating myths or binding myths that might be good. They can be really bad too. Like white people are superior to black people. That is a political myth.
Bad myth. Yeah.
That is at the heart of the American project. It's the heart of the broader Western project. Right.
Right.
And it's a myth. It's bullshit. It obviously isn't true, but it was a binding myth that kept it together. Right. And we still have those myths today. Like, where you hear the myths of things like, what about black on black crime? Or,
I was thinking about that one today too. Like if like it's the, I don't know. It's just so disingenuous, right? Like it's just it is so bullshit.
It's real bullshit. And part of it is it's because the right in this country, or the right in the US, and see, it's even my own chauvinism, right? Like you're Canadian, I'm still saying in this country, right? It's my own myopia, right? Because I'm an American and I'm an ignorant fucker. But I think that the right are really good at framing things. Mm-hmm. And we've talked about this before. Like I highly recommend, he's a liberal, but I think it's something to learn from, which is George Lakoff, linguistics professor from UC Berkeley. What about white on white crime? Well, that's just crime. Exactly. Right. Exactly. Right. Like there's just all these weird things. Like when I used to work at a bookstore when I was in college, we had a section called urban fiction. Now, what does your brain go to when you hear urban fiction?
That's about gangs, right?
It's about gangs. It's about gangs, and it's about black people.
Yeah.
Even though black people live in farms, they live in rural areas. Yep. Black people don't necessarily, or they live in the suburbs. Like black people, if you go to a major American city, it's not just all black people.
No.
It's like these terms that we've come up with. It would be much better to just say like African American fiction. But here's the really nasty part of that. Not only was it basically black fiction, but it was at the end of the fiction section.
Right.
So it was effectively in the back. It's just like being on the back of the bus. Like it's like these little subtle things. Like this is where I think Debord and other sort of postmodern thinkers are really interesting about thinking about language and how language shapes our reality and how systems and structures of power shape how we relate to it, and the Foucault stuff, and and I think that's all relevant because those are things we don't necessarily even think about.
Oh yeah, that's right.
From our own perspective, but there are other people that would because of their own perspective, right? That's where I think the left has to get better. Is we have to get better at being able to you and Urban goes back to so I'm not racist. Right. It's a way of sort of framing it without directly framing it, right? Because you could put a black fiction or African American fiction, you could put that there. But did the African American fiction section include James Baldwin? Did it include Samuel R. Delany or Octavia Butler or Audre Lorde? No, they were all in the literature section.
Yeah.
The black fiction was all of like the, these just disgusting sort of racist tropes of like baby mama gangbangers and stuff. Like it was just
probably
disgusting.
A lot of it wasn't even written by black people. It was probably written by white writers portraying black people.
Yeah. Right? And a lot of them were written by black people for sure. But but I just find that that's interesting that it's like, but those are black authors, but they're not going to go in the black fiction section.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, well, then what is the black fiction section for then? And then why are we making a distinction without a difference?
Yeah.
You know, but yeah, anyway, hopefully we're not too far off topic, but like I you know, in general, you know, cause we can start wrapping up cause we're going a little over time, but, I love this book. Urban fiction sounds like gangster rap in book form. That's exactly it. It's exactly what it is. Without a doubt. And the covers they look like rap albums from like the 90s or early 2000s. Like you're absolutely right.
Yep.
So yeah, I love this book. I think it's a book that like I will go back to in terms of thinking about, and it was like just, I'm like, and it's one of those books you read and it's talking about all these other interesting books. You're like, well, I'm going to read that book now too. Right. I'm going to read that now, or I'm going to look at that now, because it's just this wonderful wealth of information.
And
the authors do
every chapter has like footnotes galore. Like,
yep.
Like there's so many references that you can go back and like check out what's being written, what's being said. It's pretty astonishing piece of work.
One thing I'll say, maybe this is a little too inside baseball, but it's one thing I do and I've done since graduate school, which is when you're reading a book that has extensive footnotes, look at the notes first. I know that sounds kind of counterintuitive, but it's the way to go.
Yeah.
So I had a professor in graduate school who that's how she read books, where she would go to the citations first in a chapter and look through the citations and read other the extra notes and look at what they're citing, and then go back and then read the chapter. And then she would kind of go, that note goes to this, that note goes to that.
Yeah. It gives you the context and
and sense. That's how I read. That's how I read this book. That's how I read books like this is I will look through the notes first and then I read the chapter. Footnotes galore sounds like a David Gray. Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I'm still such a farmer. I read the book and I skip completely over all the footnotes. I see
sometimes you can.
I see they're there. I see them. I think they're important, but I'm not looking at them. I've got other shit to do.
And I have a very personal objection to a form of writing where they bury a lot of extra additional text in the notes.
Right.
Like, for as much as I love The Dawn of Everything, like that book is really, really guilty of this, where like they'll bury a lot in the notes. And I'm like, if you thought this was so interesting to include a huge paragraph in the notes, just put it in the main text. I'll read it.
Yeah, that's right.
Put it in parentheticals and I'll still read it. Yeah. Like, put it in the main text. Sam Harris was the worst on that. Like, his books, half the fucking book is notes. I'm like, dude, just write that into the text.
Just add a chapter, man.
I've always found that the most notes should be is like a clarifying point or defining who a person is or clarifying something, or like, for more on this, see this book, like, or specific citations. That's how I write. So but it's all about preferences. It truly is all about preferences. But yeah, like I said, I love this book. It's part of the reason I actually bought the paperback, like actual physical copy, because I figured it'd be something I'd want to keep. Yeah. And I think it's a wonderful wealth of information. I think the essays are really easy to read. Yeah. Outside of the last one, the Hart Negri one is kind of hard to read.
I think that I will finish this book, even though we've already done the episode. I was hoping I'd get it finished by the time we got up here, but I didn't. But I'm gonna probably try and finish it.
That's fine, and we've only scratched the surface. So it's a book where there's a lot of stuff I didn't talk about. We didn't really get much into the Paris Commune. We didn't get into more of the Spanish Civil War. There's a ton of stuff. We didn't even really talk about William Morris all that much. We didn't talk about the coal miners. We didn't talk about there's all kinds of stuff in the book people should check out. That I think
definitely
is worthwhile.
read this.
Yeah, I think it's worthwhile, and I think that libertarian, like the idea of libertarian or liberatory socialism, is something that we should take that term back from these right-wing chuds, because quite frankly, the Libertarian Party in the United States and its pernicious subgroup, the Mises Caucus, they're essentially fascists at this point. So, like I said, there's not much of a jump between like American right libertarianism and fascism.
And I find like right libertarians in the US are not actually libertarians, even in a capitalist sense, because they believe in government buying out or paying for companies that are failing. They believe in protectionist borders. They just aren't libertarians.
Outside of right. Like outside of maybe ANCAPs, but then I'm not as involved with ANCAP theory as others are. But like I find it like a contradiction in terms.
I find even they like it's an incoherent ideology is what it is.
Right.
So then
I don't want to pay taxes. Yeah. And it's like, I'm sorry you don't want to pay taxes, but like, do you really want to live in a society where like every time you go on a road, you have to pay a toll, or every time you have to, you have to pay a fee, like a DoorDash order to have your house taken out of fire? Like, because if you want that world, I mean, like read the book Snow Crash by Neil Stephenson. It's essentially what it is. It's like this like cyberpunk libertarian hellscape where, consulates are no longer called consulates. They're called franchulates, which is like a combining of franchises. And you have to like swipe a card, like a credit card, to go everywhere.
What's that?
And you pay for everything.
That Sylvester Stallone movie, Judge Dredd.
Oh, hell yeah. Yeah.
That's everything's corporations now.
It's that sort of gross, $1 to use the bathroom, just like in the game BioShock. No thanks. The BioShock thing is interesting. I've never played the game, but I know of the game. And I know that the game is a very explicit critique of Ayn Rand and objectivism, which I think is fascinating. Like what would Galt's Gulch really be like?
Right.
This sort of libertarian utopia. What would it really be like? It'd be like BioShock, and it would suck.
Yeah.
Right. So I think that there's a great tradition here, and so it reminded me of a book I recently got. I can't believe I found this, but this is, I think, going to be like a great primary source reader to go along with this book. But it's this No Gods, No Masters, an anthology of anarchism. It's a Daniel Guerin anthology. It has a lot of the people that are talking about in this book are in this book.
Very cool.
I found this at the Indianapolis Public Library sale. I was like, oh my gosh. So it's awesome. And so I think that it's the great thing about this book is it shows us that the sort of the domination of sort of more radical left politics by Marxism or Leninism has been a real stifling effect to the left. And I think that if we have a more sort of cosmopolitan or bohemian freelancer view, as Trotsky called CLR James, I think that's actually to our benefit, because I think that we need to get beyond some of these conceptions that didn't fully work, and try to come up with something new and be inspired by things from the past, but try new paths.
Right on. So I guess, what are we covering next time?
Next time we are covering a book that has almost nothing to do with politics. So we're going back to we've talked about the leftist stuff a lot in the mind of a skeptical leftist, right?
Yeah.
We're going back to the skeptical part. We're going to be doing Thomas Sheridan's book, Respectable Atheism.
Ah, interesting.
And it's a great book that I think goes into the title's a little misleading.
Okay.
And that's where the book's a little disappointing, but it's a really good book in the terms of he does a really great job of lining up a lot of big arguments in the sort of God debate over the last 30, 40 years and kind of lays them out in a really interesting way.
Okay.
Because it was like a class that he took, or a class that he taught, rather. So the book kind of reads like professor notes. It definitely reads like that. But I think it's interesting, and I think it gets back to the heart of what I'm trying to articulate and what we're trying to articulate here, which is this idea of a skeptical, humanist, leftist viewpoint that is ecumenical and multitudinous. And I like that kind of stuff. So that's what we'll be doing next time. And then I think in a few more weeks, we'll be doing Lizette Kolakowski's Towards a Marxist Humanism, which I love that book. And one recent addition is because I love my boy Bernie. Despite my criticisms of Bernie, I love Bernie. Bernie's got a new book out, and it's called It's Okay to Be Angry About Capitalism, which is a fucking awesome title.
That is a good title.
So we're going to be talking about Bernie's new book, which he wrote with John Nichols, who is the veteran reporter for The Nation, who wrote the book The S Word, which we'll be doing later in the summer about American socialism.
Right. Nice.
And so, so we've got all kinds of stuff coming down the pike. And then sometime in May, we're doing Murray Book Gym. We're going to do Ecology of Freedom. Cool. So stay tuned. We're doing a lot of really different stuff here. And my horizons just feel so more expanded in this new format we're doing.
That's awesome. I guess all that's left is, where can people find you?
So people can find me at justinclark.org. That's my website. You can also follow me on social media at JustinClarkPH for Public History. And I'm a regular contributor to The Truth Seeker, the Truth Seeker magazine, one of the oldest publications in the United States, and the oldest free thought publication in the world.
Nice.
I'm working now on a retrospective essay on Christopher Hitchens' God Is Not Great.
Yeah, cool.
So, which, who knows, we might do that as an episode, like as a bonus or something, because I'm going to be reading the book and writing about it. So we might talk about it. Things that I've just started rereading it for the first time in like 10 years. So there's so much of it that I'm like, oh, this is great. And then I'm like, and then there's other parts of it I'm like, oh. So it's
yeah, I imagine it is like that.
So Jimmy Snow, the YouTuber, he said something really, it's going to sound really kind of mean, but I think it's accurate, which is like, I'm glad the Hitchens died when he did. Because he arguably
was already on the reactionary track, right?
He was already on the track and he could have gotten worse.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, so anyway, yeah. I mean, I think there's a very real possibility that that he may have supported Trump. I know that sounds like really
it's possible,
heretical, but I think it's possible.
It's possible.
But anyway, anyway, or maybe even supported Brexit. I don't know. Hitchens may have not gotten completely off the deep end.
That's true.
I don't know.
He was a surprising person.
He was a very surprising person, who was not really set in any meaningful way, like ideologically. So, but anyway, so I'm doing a retrospective on that. I've got some new stuff up on the website. My newest essay up there is The Humanism of Star Trek, and talking about my love of Star Trek. We'll be doing a book about Star Trek later in the summer. And,
nice.
In the intersections of humanist ideas and Star Trek. So, yeah, I'm a busy man.
And you were just on Ben Burgess's show last night.
I should mention that. Yeah. So I was just on Ben Burgess's show, Give Them an Argument. We did almost 2 hours talking about Scientology.
Yeah.
And which we talked about on this show with reviewing Mike Rinder's book. And talking about, Scientology being sort of this uniquely American religion where it's about money and hierarchy and abuse and oppression and exploitation. And, it was the first time I was ever really, besides our podcast that we did on Rinder's book, it was really great to the intersection of talking about left politics and left theory with talking about Scientology.
Right.
Because talking about Scientology sometimes can be a little apolitical.
Right.
But I don't want it to be that. I want it to be very political because I think it's relevant.
Because it should be. Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, that's what's going on, man. We're getting into the springtime. I'm going to get busy. I'm going to be doing lots of public speaking events over the summer for both work and for fun. So yeah, stay tuned, folks.
Right on. Well, I guess thank you very much for joining me. And
thanks, Corey.
Thanks, everybody who watched the live show.
Thank you for those with your wonderful comments, and thank you for watching the live. And I also want to thank the person who I think recommended we do this book. I'm not sure if it was you had recommended it or if a commenter had recommended it.
I think it was Kerrigan.
And so I want to thank Kerrigan for recommending this book because I loved it, and I think that it has broadened my horizons exponentially. Right So it's great.
All right. Night, everybody.
Good night.
All right. That's all, folks. Thanks for watching and or listening. Remember to share this show with your friends or on the social media site that you use the most. Thank you to everyone who supports this show on Patreon. I really appreciate it, and it helps me survive, which is essentially the only way that projects like this can continue for me. If you want to contribute, you can do that at patreon.com/skepticalleftist, or you can buy me a coffee at buymeacoffee.com/skepticalleft. If you can't contribute financially, then a like on YouTube or a 5-star rating and a review on Apple Podcasts or on one of the podcast review sites like Podchaser would be great. If you want to find more from me, then make sure to check the show notes for links to all my stuff and to check out my website, skepticalleftist.com. There you can find the videos I do with my friend Damian Marie Adhope, and all my old content from the Brainstorm podcast, Skeptarchy, and from my newly retired show, From Many People's Strength. You can also find links to my Discord, Reddit, and Twitch. You can contact me through my website or by emailing mindofaskepticalleftist@gmail.com. My Twitter is @skepticallefty. My Facebook page is The Mind of a Skeptical Leftist, and my Mastodon is collectiva.social/@skepticalleftist. Thanks so much for listening and or watching, and make sure to leave a comment on the video or on my website. Join your local org, print off some posters or pamphlets, and spread the propaganda.